How's it going, everyone? Welcome back once again to baddestchaplain.com. Baddest Chaplain on the globe here. Chris Burton once again. Hoping all is well with you and yours. Today, we're going to be able to take all of you who probably were like me, those of you who are outside of Tennessee, maybe even those of you who are inside of Tennessee, wondering what exactly is going on. Obviously, with everything going back to the horrific shooting at the Covenant School and down to the ways in which things have played out in the state legislature with the results of protesting gun violence and the rebuke and even the expulsion of two local representatives there and collectively trying to expel the Tennessee Three. We're going to be speaking with my good brother. He is the second vice president of the NAACP Nashville branch. He's an activist. He's a proud alumnus of Fisk University, advocate, blogger, community organizer, human rights advocate. I mean, this brother don't sleep. They just plug him in, he charges up, and he goes back to work. Every day, every day, his feet hit the ground. I know the devil is upset. He's like, here he goes again,
Here I come again.
to
Absolutely.
make the community better. But Timothy Hughes, man,
Brother
how you
Burton,
doing,
thank
man?
you, man, so much for that introduction and for the opportunity to come on this amazing podcast. It's never a dull moment to be a part of the community that the Baddest Chaplain is building and to be a part of the work that we're doing collectively to try to bring awareness, to make sure that our folks, our communities are paying attention in these critical and important moments. And ever since we had the opportunity to be a part of the Memorial Foundation Fellowship together and be a part of that experience, I've been looking forward to us having some more conversation, having more engagement about these important issues. So thank you so much for extending the opportunity for me to come on and to talk about what's been happening in Tennessee.
Absolutely. It's always an honor, brother. It's always an honor.
Absolutely.
And that's the thing. As I think about everything going on, I just need you to start us off by just walking us through those moments when you learned about what was happening with the Tennessee Three. Of course, Justin Pearson, Justin Jones, and Gloria Johnson. Walk us through that, from soup to nuts. Your experience.
Absolutely. I'm going to take a little bit of a point of personal privilege, and I'm going to take us a step back a little bit before what has happened with the Tennessee Three to kind of set up what happened from the standpoint of redistricting in the state of Tennessee during the aftermath of or the continuation of the process with COVID, how it influenced that process and so forth. So for those who are in the audience who pay attention to these conversations around redistricting, I'm sure that you folks are probably already aware of kind of how this process works, but in 30 seconds or less, the redistricting process happens every 10 years, and it coincides with the taking of the census. The decennial census that happens every 10 years. They count the number of residents through in the United States and in each of the individual states specifically, and they appropriate the districts and how it is that individuals are elected and the rules of engagement, as it were, in terms of how it is that people get involved civically, get elected to public office during that redistricting process. It happens every 10 years after the census count. So, of course, the audience knows, and we are in many ways still in the throes of this COVID-19 pandemic. It is beginning to wane, but it was an issue that was very, very top of mind during the redistricting process of 2020. So we've got COVID-19, we've got the redistricting process that's supposed to happen where they draw the lines, set up the parameters of how elections are done and how resources are allocated in the states. And during that process, people are trying to collect the data, collect the information about residents who are moving into and out of the state of Tennessee. At one point, specifically in Middle Tennessee, where I live in Nashville, there were 100 residents a day moving into Middle Tennessee, many of them working and living in Nashville and in Middle Tennessee. So that's happening. That population increase is happening in our city and in our state. And during that time, the legislators are determining what's going to happen with regard to how the distribution of districts, how the distribution of resources are being allocated, and so forth. So we move a little bit forward into January of 2023. And in that time, Tyree Nichols is shot and killed, or beaten to death, rather, in Memphis, Tennessee. And in the aftermath of his terrible and merciless killing at the hands of Memphis police officers, 5 of whom were African Americans, there's an uprising and uproar to try to do something about these police killings. We saw it in 2020 in the aftermath of the killings of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor. And so there's been a lot of movement in local jurisdictions to address issues of police accountability and public safety. And many of the jurisdictions that are addressing those issues
Mm-hmm.
are creating community oversight boards. I'm going to put that pin in community oversight boards here for just a moment. As it pertains to the context of Memphis
Got you.
and Tyree Nichols, they have what is called a police accountability or a police review board, but not a full-scale police
Mm-hmm.
oversight board, which is going to become important here in just a second. So we move forward from Tyree Nichols' murder to a process that was happening in a place called Manchester, Tennessee, which is in rural West Tennessee. A family there of African Americans is driving through on March the 17th. They're on their way from Chicago, Illinois to Atlanta, Georgia. They drive through Manchester,
Mm-hmm.
Tennessee, and are stopped by the Tennessee Highway Patrol. Their children, 5 of them, are taken away from them and put into the child welfare system. The husband is arrested. The mother is not allowed to see her children. And what happens as a result of that is these children are essentially being seized by the state representatives in Manchester in an effort to funnel them into a very, very dangerously broken child welfare system in the state of Tennessee. The state of Tennessee's DCS has been investigated by the federal government for their mistreatment of children. So that's the context in which these Black children are being taken into the system. And this is one among many instances where Black
Mm-hmm.
children are being taken away for reasons that don't make sense from individual family members or parents in this case. And those children are taken away and seized. As a result, there are protests that are lodged and individuals from the National Action Network, NAACP, to try to find out, first of all, what is happening with these children, why they're being taken away. And secondly, to figure out how we can do something about our overburdened Department of Children's Services and the children that are basically being forced to sleep on the bare floors inside buildings because there's nowhere for these children to go. So that's March 2023.
Mm-hmm.
And then shortly thereafter, maybe a week later, after the children are seized and taken away, the children were kept in children's services care for almost 56 days. Consequently, they've now been returned to the family. But this is an ongoing situation, an ongoing federal inquiry into what's happening with children's services in Tennessee. We have the Covenant School massacre that occurs at the Covenant School in Green Hills, which is a neighborhood in Nashville, very affluent, conservative white neighborhood, conservative Christian school, which is once again, visited upon by assassins' bullets. AR-15s are used. The individual who was involved in this case shot and killed 3 elementary school students and 3 staffers, among them the head of the school, who was killed in this Covenant School shooting on March the 22nd. So I'm sorry, 27th. So that's kind of a lead-in to what's been happening over and over again in the Tennessee legislature. There's no conversation or accountability about police misconduct. There's no conversation or accountability about the proliferation of guns and the lack of transparency or accountability for the individuals who are selling these weapons of war on our city streets and allowing individuals to have access to them without background checks, without any kinds of measures or protections to make sure that the individuals who are receiving those weapons have been screened and that they've done some kind of due diligence to make sure that the community is protected. So all of that is happening in the lead up. The Tennessee legislature, as a result of the redistricting process and the heavy-handed tactics of some of the Republicans who are in the supermajority in both houses in the state of Tennessee and also occupy the governorship, which again, complete Republican Party rule in the state of Tennessee on the state level. And so they've drawn these lines, gerrymandered the district, set it up in such a way that it's very, very difficult for anyone other than them to win in that process. In come Justin Jones, Justin Pearson, and Gloria Johnson, who are elected officials from Memphis, Nashville, and Knoxville, respectively. Those individuals are then trying to get legislation through the process, trying to get it through some of the committees, trying to get it into floor debates, trying to insert conversations around police accountability, around responsible gun ownership and responsible gun laws into the conversation. And during this time, the state legislature is pushing all kinds of anti-trans and anti-LGBT and anti-Black and anti-poor people legislation through the process. They are pushing through a piece of legislation that will remove any kinds of restrictions on background checks, remove any kinds of restrictions in terms of making sure that individuals who get access to guns, if they are adjudicated mentally ill or mentally incapable of having those weapons or should not have access to those weapons, that red flag laws can be used to try to make sure that they temporarily hold those weapons from individuals who might be likely to do the kinds of things that later happened in the Covenant school shooting. So all of that is happening, and there's a lot of energy around doing something to prevent gun violence. And so in the maelstrom of that energy, Justin Jones, Justin Pearson, and Gloria Johnson, they overstep some procedural rules in the House, and essentially when the House goes into recess, they enter the well of the House of Representatives, and in unison with the individuals who are standing in the gallery in the state legislature, they began to chant with them, "No justice, no peace." And so that is seen as a breach of decorum, but it is very much in keeping with the history of all three of these individuals who were elected to represent some 300,000 Tennesseans in their various districts. Justin Jones comes from a history of protest. He's a student organizer from Fisk University, and also received some training at the Vanderbilt Divinity School, where he will complete his Master's of Theology in a few months. Justin Pearson has a history of activism around environmental justice issues in Memphis, and Gloria Johnson has always been an advocate or an ally for issues related to police accountability and justice in Knoxville, Tennessee. Former school teacher who cares about issues related to educational equity. So all of these things are in the wheelhouse of these elected officials, and they are longtime advocates and allies around issues related to accountability, around issues related to violence, changing the standard as it relates to how it is that Tennessee addresses those issues. So folks know full well who they're dealing with and who they've elected to these offices. And then when they go in and they make this statement of solidarity with representatives and constituents from their districts, they are in keeping with the ethos of that moment. People want something done to prevent these kinds of mass shootings that keep happening over and over again. And as a result of that act of protest, that act of civil disobedience, there is a process to expel these three lawmakers. The process goes through, and there is a vote to expel successfully Justin Jones and Justin Pearson. Gloria Johnson is nearly expelled from the state house and is able to be saved by one vote. That one vote was Justin Pearson's vote to protect her.
My goodness.
If the order of the expulsion, order of expulsion had been done differently, because they were so eager to expel Justin Jones because he was one of those individuals who had repeatedly been up to the Capitol, engaged in nonviolent direct action to remove a bust of Nathan Bedford Forrest, who was one of the founders of the Ku Klux Klan, who had a bust that was erected in the 1970s and placed in the Capitol. So that bust was later removed, and Justin Jones was later elected. So Justin Jones has been on their target list for a long time. And they saw an opportunity to try to remove him. So they were so eager. They were so eager to vote him out and to expel him. And then they put Gloria Johnson up next for expulsion. And she was able to be spared by one vote. And that vote was from Justin Pearson. So they're expelled. Justin Jones, Justin Pearson expelled from the legislature. Essentially 200,000 individuals in the state of Tennessee, both in Memphis and in Nashville, the two most populous cities in the state, are removed from representation, and their constituents no longer have a voice in the legislature. And the reaction to that was not at all what the Republican majority expected. As a result of their expulsion, the eyes of the entire country, and I would say the world, were turned to Tennessee to figure out exactly what is going on. What is happening where, for the first time, one of the first times in the state's history, you are expelling individuals from their service in the legislature for a peaceful protest at the same time that there are federal investigations, ongoing federal investigations of sitting lawmakers in the legislative body for things such as financial mismanagement, for violation of ethics laws. I mean, there's Justin Jones does a very, very yeoman's job of delegating and laying out the case for a number of sitting
Yeah.
legislators who could have been censured, if not expelled, for the very actions that I've just described. But
Wow.
instead, for a peaceful protest
Yeah, yeah,
to
yeah.
remove guns from the hands of individuals who should not have them, Justin Jones and Justin Pearson were expelled from their seats. So, in very short order, I'll go ahead and sum it up and give an opportunity for us to have some conversation about it. Justin Jones and Justin Pearson
Goodness.
are able to be
Yeah,
reappointed
yeah.
by their local jurisdictions in the Shelby County Commission and the Metro Council of Nashville, Tennessee.
That's
And
right.
so they are very quickly returned back to their legislative seats and will now have to sit for a special election in each of their districts, which it's very likely that they will be reelected to those positions as well. But upon their return to the
Okay.
legislature,
Yeah, yeah.
the clock starts over again in terms of legislation. And so each of them pledge with the remaining 15 pieces of legislation that they can submit, that they will
That's right.
then return to proposing legislation to bring about a sensible reaction to some of the gun issues that are happening in our state. And both have been good to their word in submitting those pieces of legislation ahead of the end of the legislative session, which is coming very quickly at the end of April. So that is where things kind of stand in a 10,000-foot view. There's a lot of energy that has
Yeah.
been galvanized. The Vice President of the United States has been here on several occasions to uplift the issue of gun violence and the need for there to
Right,
be
right.
changes on the state legislative level. The Tennessee Three have been invited to the White House and will be meeting with Joe Biden by the end of the month to have some conversation about what needs to be done to address this issue. So what in many ways, as the scripture would say, or as the old folks in the church would say, what the devil meant for evil, God has turned around and meant
Come
for
on.
good. And so we see now in this moment,
Listen.
at a moment when the Tennessee, when the powers that be in Tennessee were pulling in one direction, the people of Tennessee have pulled us in another direction. And so I'm very excited to be at the center of what is happening in this
Yeah.
moment, to be observing legislatively how the policies have begun to shift, how the narratives and conversations have begun to shift, and how the Tennessee Three have really reinvigorated a lot of the organizing that has been happening here on the ground in Tennessee for a number of years. But it's certainly gotten a shot in the arm over the past several weeks to see what has been happening in reaction to this unlawful and unnecessary expulsion.
Absolutely. Hey, the irony of it that isn't lost on me is that something that I'm sure those who oppose the work of the Tennessee Three wish would just quietly go away was really sort of like catalyzed by their own actions.
Their own
You now
overreach.
have to. I don't think it's an overestimation.
Yes.
Their
Yes.
own
Yes.
overreach.
Yes.
I don't think it's an exaggeration to say the whole world is watching. That doesn't feel like an exaggeration at all.
I've had people
And it's
who
partly
are
they're doing.
a part of the work of movement building and media amplification of these stories who have called me from as far away as Ottawa, Canada. I've got friends of mine who are studying abroad in Paris, France, and in Italy and other places. And the entire world, the BBC is on one channel and MSNBC is on the other, and both of them are interviewing the Justins and Gloria, just talking about what has happened in Tennessee and what really needs to happen and change in the way that we address these issues related to community violence and public safety. And the fact that the Republican Party in Tennessee and the GOP specifically in their leadership have now turned the spotlight on themselves. And what they've actually done is shown just how problematic the situation is in Tennessee. Our state legislature, specifically people like the House Speaker, who does not apparently, as a result of some of the investigative journalism that's been done, he apparently doesn't even live in the district that he represents, and is carrying on, according to some of the reports from the investigators who have been looking into it, an extramarital affair with a staffer who reports to the governor. So it's all kinds of ethics violations and questions about what is acceptable and what isn't. Just yesterday, there was a resignation from, I believe, the vice chair of the Tennessee GOP, who was also an elected official representing a district here in Middle Tennessee, who was carrying on relationships or creating a hostile work environment for several of the interns who work on the legislative capitol. And so he resigned after the report was made that he might be investigated for some of these activities. So it's all kinds of pandemonium and chaos that is happening in their caucus. And I doubt
Oh
very
yes.
seriously
Oh yes.
if a lot of these things would be coming to light if it were not for the fact that Republicans overreached in their reaction to this peaceful protest from the Tennessee Three.
That is it. That is astounding. The ways in which all of this is coming to bump, and you're seeing more and more actual credible ethics violations far beyond the pale of decorum issues.
That absolutely right, absolutely right.
That is remarkable.
Well, I will say that
Truly
in
is.
many ways
So,
this is
so
just this is reminiscent, right, of the history of Tennessee writ
mm,
large, and in its contributions and its history around issues related to civil and human rights. I mean, for those who are in the audience who are listening, I'm sure they are aware of the history in Memphis and in Nashville with the protests that were
mm-hmm,
there in
mm-hmm.
Memphis for the sanitation workers, which ultimately resulted in the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.
Of
And also
course,
in Nashville, Tennessee in the
of
1960s, the
course.
sit-in movement with the students who, in the aftermath, actually the anniversary
Oh yes.
of the attack on the home of Z. Alexander Luby, who at the time was a civil rights activist, a member of the NAACP, and was an attorney representing the interests of the students and the
Yeah.
protesters. His home was bombed, and in the aftermath of his home being bombed, Diane Nash, and several other community organizers and leaders who
Mm-hmm.
were residents of Tennessee, some of the high school students and college students from Tennessee A&I and Fisk
Right.
University, marched to the Capitol and confronted then Mayor Ben West and said to Mayor Ben West, "Do you think it's right that Black Nashvillians are not allowed to be served at the lunch counters, are not allowed to be treated as first-class citizens in the city of Nashville?" And it seemed that Ben West, at the time the mayor, responded to Diane Nash's query by saying, "Well, you know what? I do believe it's not right. I do believe that we should change some of these laws and some of these regulations." And it was at that point that Nashville became one of the early cities in the South that began to desegregate its public facilities and its lunch
Right.
counters. And so that gave birth
Yes.
to an energy to what was already a rising civil rights movement in the 1950s and 60s. And so there's a long history of Tennessee, of Nashville, of places like Knoxville,
Mm-hmm.
which house some of the training grounds for many of the early civil rights leaders at places like the Haley Farm and at the Highlander Center, where many of the early civil rights leaders in the
Yes.
1950s and 60s received their training. So there's a long history of civil disobedience and nonviolent direct
Mm-hmm.
action that comes out of Nashville, out of Memphis, out of Tennessee, out of the Tennessee context. And so the Tennessee Three are
Yeah.
basically just contributing their legacy to that larger, broader narrative around civil disobedience and
Yes.
nonviolence direct action.
Certainly, certainly, and brother, you touched on something I want to ask you further about, especially for the benefit of our younger listeners.
Yeah.
Like, what do you know about your rights now that you wish you knew when you were a teenager? Like, what are the things that you're doing now? Because so many of the people you're describing started this where Diane Nash was a teenager, John Lewis was a teenager. You talk about Justin Pearson's work when he was younger. Thinking about our role as young people, and especially those like younger, like high school age, college age, in this work, like what do you wish you knew back when you were in that age category that you know now that you can share with young folks listening?
I appreciate that question so much. I think that the power that young people have is something that is often not really considered. As you mentioned, I mean, many of the early civil rights leaders, the Diane Nashes and the John Lewises, and many of the folks who got involved in the sit in movement were high school students and college students. They were very, very young teenagers who understood that their voice and their value was not just in knowing and understanding issues, but uplifting and giving voice to issues and concerns. And so sometimes that looks like, by the time you become an 18-year-old and you get registered to vote and voting at the ballot box. But some of these young people are not waiting until they're a voting age to
Right.
get engaged in the process. Many of the students from the Marjorie Douglas Stoneman School in Florida. They were high school students and middle school
Come
students
on.
when they got
Right.
engaged in the process for
Yeah.
creating March for Our
Yeah.
Lives. Many of the uprisings that occurred in 2020 were coordinated by young people working together in various online forums and getting together on TikTok and in other places. We had a demonstration of young teenagers, 13, 14, and 15 years old, who gathered 10,000 people at the steps
Mm.
of the Capitol in the uprisings in 2020. And many of those folks have gone on to
Remarkable.
graduate from high school and become engaged in civic engagement in a number of different capacities. And so I wish that when I was a young person, I really
No doubt.
understood that power. I really understood that I didn't have to wait for the world to change, that I could go about
Yeah.
the process of changing it myself. And so I would encourage those young listeners who are in the
Mm-hmm.
audience, the middle schoolers and the high schoolers who are seeing something that isn't right and isn't just. John Lewis would say that it is incumbent upon us when we see something that isn't right to say something. When we have the opportunity to get into good and necessary
Yes.
trouble, that we do so. And sometimes that would look like letter writing
Right.
campaigns or emailing to your local officials. Sometimes it looks like organizing and coming together to create healing spaces for young people. The elementary school students who we lost at the Covenant School have been having meetings together so that they can talk
Mm.
about how to navigate the very, very deep and painful wounds that have been left behind as a result of this incident, but also what we
Oh
do with the
gosh.
energy
Right.
that has been galvanized in these moments to address issues of public safety and make the children in our schools feel safe. It's critically important that they are a part of and they're contributing their voices to that discussion. So whatever age you are, whatever station you are in life, and in
Yeah.
whatever place you find yourself and where you reside in your situation in life, it's important that you understand that your voice matters, that your contribution matters in whatever capacity
Absolutely.
you can make it, and that we all have a role to play in making the world the kind of world in which we can all not
Mm-hmm.
just survive but thrive.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And I think, with what we're saying, it definitely brings to mind the work of the great Ella Baker, who understood the priority of children in the work and
Yes,
priority of young people in the work. So definitely want to lift that name up for sure.
that's right. That's right.
I,
Absolutely.
I want to talk with you a bit about the importance. Certainly, certainly. I want to talk with you a bit about the importance of legacy organizations. You know, being second vice president for the NAACP, being involved in a variety of organizations, being a proud alum of the historic Black College, Fisk University. Talk to me about the role of legacy organizations and you finding your own place in the movement. How has your membership in the NAACP, being an alum of Fisk, helped you with understanding, what's the part you play?
So my relationship and my connection to the NAACP goes back a long way. I've been recently engaged as a member of the leadership, but as a youth, I was a part of the AXO program. My grandmother back home in Louisiana, she's from a little place called New Roads, Louisiana, was very active in her local branch of the NAACP. And so I grew up around folks who believed in the importance of civic engagement. My father was a retired military officer in the United States Air
Mm-hmm.
Force. My mother was a school teacher. And so giving back was kind of an integral part of my acculturation just to life and how it is that we navigate the world. And so when I got to Nashville
Right.
and had the opportunity to study at Fisk University, I began to learn about the life and the legacy of these pioneers in not only in Black history, but in American history and world history. Folks like W.E.B. Du Bois, who was very integral in
Of
the
course.
Niagara movement, which later gave birth to and created the NAACP.
Right.
In 1905 is when they started the Niagara movement, and
Right.
in the early 1900s is the creation of the local branch of the NAACP. And Du Bois, during his time both as a student and later as an activist and a writer and a public intellectual, was very, very engaged and involved in the growth and the development of the early NAACP, which won all of these historic civil rights cases
Mm-hmm.
under Charles Hamilton Houston, who at the time was the head of the LDF and the Legal Defense Fund of the NAACP. And these
Right.
were the individuals, along with Thurgood Marshall and other brothers and other folks in the community, who I had trained up in this legacy of nonviolent direct action, but also in building out a platform that addressed the
Yes.
material needs and concerns of communities, Black communities, communities of color, and all communities in the United States and around the world. And so that was kind of a formative experience for me as a young person, and later in my matriculation to Fisk University, became just a part of the ethos of the experience of being a student at Fisk with the long legacy of great leaders, folks like Diane Nash and John Lewis and others who were also Fisk alums and had
Hmm.
connection to that legacy. And so I was incumbent upon those of us who were a part of that history, a part of those legacy institutions, to continue to address the needs and concerns of our community members. And so in my time as second vice president, I oversee and involved in supporting the efforts around economic justice, efforts around health equity, addressing issues and concerns for brothers and sisters who are returning from institutions, prisons and jails, addressing some of the political
Right.
action that is occurring in the
Right.
legislative process and connecting that to the lived experience of folks who are on the ground, and also working in connection with religious affairs, our faith leaders, who are oftentimes first responders to a lot of the issues that are happening in our communities, because institutionally the Black church, right, is where we got our resource and our support, not only to nurture our souls, but also in many instances to nurture
Man.
families. Like literally people were able to get mutual aid support and
Right.
food support and
Come on.
assistance from their pastors and ministers and those who were in the clergy. So
Right.
having
Right.
the relationship and the connection with folks who are in the faith community, and being able to have relationship and connection to the Black Clergy Collective of Memphis and other institutions like the Interdenominational Ministers Fellowship, who are really there on the front lines addressing some of these concerns and
Hmm.
issues, has really been an honor of a lifetime. And so continuing to build that work and build that legacy is something that I'm very proud to be a part of and very grateful to be contributing to. But I also feel like in many ways, so many of the challenges that we're facing, particularly the current challenges and the modern challenges around police accountability, police shootings of unarmed Black men, individuals who are taking, the role of vigilante
Hmm.
and are attacking individuals in our community with guns that are having too much easy access to those weapons without any sense of accountability or responsibility for the actions. I mean, we see now with the proliferation of people who are being shot and killed for innocuous things. I mean, knocking on a door because you were looking for your siblings and you happen
Right.
to take a right when
Come
you should have
on.
taken a left, should not be result in a death sentence. And it's not just happening, right, to Black and brown folks.
Absolutely.
It is spreading. It's in the same way that a virus would spread.
Talk. Speak on it.
It is spreading to other parts of the community. So when we don't address these issues when they're affecting Black and brown people, they don't just stay with our community, they eventually begin to affect everybody. Thus, we have the situation in the Covenant School with a predominantly white, predominantly
Absolutely.
wealthy, all of the resources, all of the access, and still these kinds of mass shooting incidents can occur in those neighborhoods. So it's very, very incumbent upon us
Hmm.
as a
My
community
God.
to understand that there is not an us and them, there is only a we.
Only a we. Only a we. Thank you for that. Thank you for that. What is your hope for the world in this moment?
I ask myself that question quite a bit because oftentimes when I'm at the legislature and sitting in some of these committee rooms, and I'm hearing them propose legislation to outlaw drag shows, but not to outlaw AR-15s. When we see the expulsion or the attempted expulsion of the Tennessee Three, when we have amongst us in the legislative body individuals who are breaking laws, breaking rules, violating protocols every single day, but are never held to account. When at a time when police accountability should be at the center of our conversations around public safety, we have the state legislature seeking to ban the use of police accountability boards and any kind of protections for community members from rogue police officers. It is difficult at times to find a sense of hope. But my hope
Yeah.
lies not necessarily in our daily lived circumstances, but in a long arc of historical memory. I think it was Brother Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. who said
Yes.
that the arc of the universe, the moral universe, is long, but it bends toward justice. And I think that what we need to remember is
Absolutely.
that it does not bend spontaneously. It doesn't bend by accident. It is we who stay in the
Mm.
work, who are
Mm-hmm.
committed to the
Mm-hmm.
struggle, long and protracted though it may be. Those of us who are willing to get into the good and
Right.
necessary trouble, who bend that arc toward justice. And so, so what I try to do every day in the work that I do, whether it's in, you know, civic education, making sure folks know what the separation of powers are and what the levels of government do and whose responsibility it is to do what, or if it's, you know, direct action and protest, making sure that we're holding account those folks who are in positions, who are elected to serve our interests, and often serve the interests of those who are
Mm-hmm.
giving them, you know, money rather than the trust that we have put them in
Right.
positions of power. Um, I think it's necessary to remind ourselves that we make a contribution. We pick up the mantle, we carry the torch in as many ways as we can for as long as we can while we can, and then we prepare and equip the next
Mm-hmm.
generation of
Mm-hmm.
leaders to do the same. And so I have been very very inspired by the number of young people who have been involved in these recent demonstrations. The walkouts from the high school and middle school students who have shown up at the Capitol repeatedly demanding that their
Right.
voices be heard. The students and the young people from March for Our Lives and some of the youth organizers who are rising up and who will not be silent and allow themselves to be marginalized and pushed to the side by elected officials who are seeking to ignore those young voices. I think they are the ones
Mm.
who give me inspiration and hope. And many of my colleagues and comrades
Yeah.
who are in the youth NAACPs and some of the young leaders who are
Mm-hmm.
emerging and coming up. I can remember when, you know, Justin Jones and Justin Pearson were just students at some of the local high schools and colleges and
Wow.
universities when they first got involved as young organizers, and to see their growth and their development and their evolution, not only as organizers and activists, but now as lawmakers, now being in a position to create policy that can address the
Yeah.
concerns and the issues. I think that that is a very
Right.
powerful statement to the level of commitment and persistence that both Justin Jones and Justin Pearson have, and many of the other lawmakers who are young black and brown folks who come from working class backgrounds and who are committed to
Mm-hmm.
addressing the needs and the material concerns of their communities. They give me hope, and so it can be a
Mm-hmm.
struggle sometimes when you see some of this policy violence that they're proposing and pushing out into some of our
Sure.
communities. But what where I am finding hope is in the great camaraderie and the strength that we're drawing from one another. The fact that we now have some transparency and some accountability in the eyes of the world are watching, and the media institutions are covering some of these concerns that we've had for a long time and giving them voice, giving them amplification, which I think has been very good to be seen and heard and
Mm-hmm.
felt in many, many important ways. And then, of course, recognizing that I myself, as somebody who's been in the work and been in organizing since the death of Trayvon Martin back in 2012, having an opportunity to be in community with other
Yes.
like-minded folks, being a part of the Memorial Foundation Fellowship really reinvigorated my
Mm-hmm.
desire to stay in the work of community organizing,
Good.
movement building, and so it's been
Good.
great to have just kind of that catalyst moment and those elements of support from the broader
Yeah.
community to kind of help us stay going and stay focused on the work. It's been an honor and a privilege to be a part of helping to reimagine what is possible, both for Tennessee and for Nashville, but also
Mm-hmm.
for our community in a larger sense. So, really, really a blessing and a privilege to be a part of
Absolutely. No, wonderfully said. Wonderfully said. And just I just want to thank you so much for just really providing, and I hope you all listening and watching have received this too, a rich education on not just the current events, but really just going back to like the roots of it, going to what I would call the scene of the crime,
There you go.
contextualizing all of it. It wasn't just a spontaneous breaking of decorum, but it was a long time coming. A lot of events happening, line after line after line. And so, thank you so much, Timothy Hughes, second vice president of the NAACP chapter in Nashville. Thank you so much for being with us today. And before we close, is there anything that you would like for the listeners and watchers to be doing in their own local context?
Absolutely. Thank you so much for prompting me to give that call to action, because I always try to do that. The community organizer in me always wants to issue a call to action. And so, for those who are in your local context, whatever place you're from, whatever it is that you do on a regular basis, make sure that you, first of all, if you have the ability to be registered to vote, that you do so. I know that here in our local context in Tennessee, we have some 500,000 individuals who have been barred from being able to register to vote due to criminal disenfranchisement. And so a number of our folks feel like, oh, well, maybe I've lost my
Mm-hmm.
right to vote. I don't really have a stake in the game. I don't have a voice to be heard. I don't have a way to contribute to this work and to this fight. Brothers and sisters and folks who are impacted by the legal system, you do have a voice. You do have a role to play in this work. And so if you have found
Yeah.
yourself in a situation where you have lost your right to vote, make sure that you're plugged in with organizations like the NAACP, who are actively working through legal measures to make sure that you can get your voting rights restored. And build with our partners and local organizations who are helping to empower individuals who have been impacted by the criminal legal system to get your voting rights back. And if you're unable, if you're a part of a community where your voting rights have been permanently limited, there are ways that you can amplify your voice and still have a conversation around the importance of civic engagement at every level in government, and participate in ways that amplify the voices of others who have been similarly impacted, because it's critically important that everybody make a contribution to this work. Uh, I also encourage those of you who are under the sound of my
Mm-hmm.
voice, who are still trying to find a place or a space to be engaged, to consider getting involved in your local NAACP branch. The work that is happening on the local level is often happening in silos. And so a lot of folks aren't talking to one another. And so the NAACP, if for no other reason, it could serve as a convening space for the many voices who are trying to make contributions to this work, maybe working through a local branch. And if your branch is not particularly active or has been made inactive, either consider reactivating it, or consider the possibility of working in coalition and in partnership with some of the local organizations and groups who are finding support and work through the NAACP. Highly recommend doing that, because you want to be tapped in as much as possible to some of these local, statewide, and national partnerships, because they are able to amplify the messaging, amplify the work that's happening, and get you connected to what is happening in your local context, so that you know when the elections are coming up, know what issues are being centered in your local context, and be able to have sort of a conversation in a community when the work gets hard and when you need to lean on some folks for support. Always great to have some other folks who you can do the work with, because if we allow ourselves to try to do this work in silos, we are not able to be as effective as
Mm.
we're able to do it collectively and in community with one another. So highly recommend tapping into your folks, getting connected to your local community groups, your local organizations, your local NAACP branch, your local housing authority, your local community and local government, because a lot of folks don't understand that while politics on the national level with the presidential elections and all of those things are critically important,
Right.
those folks are not as accessible to you. You can't, maybe you can't go over to the White House and knock on the door, but your local alderman or your local city council person, your local school
Right.
board member, your local elected legislator in the legislature, those folks are much more accessible to you. And oftentimes the things that impact your life more directly are handled on the local level. So it's critically important that you get
Come
engaged in
on.
the local context as much as
Absolutely.
possible. So I would leave those three things with you. Get connected to your folks in your community through your local NAACP branch, your local community organizations. Make sure that you're registered to vote if you're able to vote, and you do so in every election. And make sure that you stay plugged in to the folks who are doing the work on the local level. Follow local media organizations and local media outlets, and local influencers and other folks who are amplifying information in the media, because they can be very, very useful in getting your message out whenever there is a concern or a crisis. It's important to make sure that you are building those relationships 24/7, 365 days a year. The last thing you want to do is only show up when there's a crisis. You want to show up when there's community.
Right. Absolutely. Thank you for that. Thank you for that. Uh, Folks, you can follow us at Baddest Chaplain on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, TikTok. Follow this platform on YouTube. Subscribe on YouTube at Baddest Chaplain, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Anchor. Thank you so much, Timothy Hughes, everyone. Thank you so much for watching, for listening, and just be safe, be blessed, and in the words of the great Frederick Douglass, agitate, agitate, agitate. All right. Much love, everyone. Take care.
Peace and blessings, y'all.